Alrighty. Hope you're doing well and staying safe from the snow, this crazy weather, that's for sure. Let's jump right in here. One housekeeping note, in a very exciting way, we are just about a week away from Purim, which means that this week is Parshat Zachor. We'll be having readings both during all the services, indoors and outdoors. Also special readings at the end of davening for those who just want to come for that. And then also we'll be doing a reading via Zoom for those who will not remember to make up the obligation in the summer in Parshat Kitetse. So that'll all be posted in the newsletter, so follow along. It's very, a person really should make every effort to hear Parshat Zachor. It's a biblical commandment. And we remember what the Amalekites did to us as we left Egypt. In the meantime, though, we are getting ready for Purim. Like I said, a lot of excitement. And I want to actually spend a few minutes talking about this week's Parsha, which really is the, I guess you would call it the beginning of the discussion of the Mishkan, the creating of the sanctuary for God. And we have Parshat Teruma, we'll have Parshat Tetzaveh, and then we'll have Parshat Kitisa in between, but then we go back to Parshat Vayakhel and Pekudei, which again goes on and talks a lot about the building of the sanctuary, the tabernacle, and eventually lays out again how we build the temple as well. And we talk about the vessels, we talk about the clothing for the Kohen Gadol, how it was erected, all the adornments, everything that has to do with the Mishkan. But I want to ask, I guess, before we even jump into any of that, a more fundamental question, which is what is the entire purpose of the Mishkan? Why does God command the Jewish people to build a Mishkan? That's the question I want to spend time on. What's the purpose of it?
That's where his spirit dwells, in the Mishkan.
Okay, but why does God need a place for his spirit to dwell?
So everybody knows where he is.
But up until now, so why didn't God tell Abraham to build a tabernacle? What is it about this moment now that's so significant that God says, okay, I want to build a tabernacle. I need a place. So you're right, it's a place for God to live in. Good, I don't disagree. In fact, take a look at the psukim here. Let me share my screen here just so you can have a sense of exactly what we're talking about. Let me just scooch that over. I hope you can see this. I can make it a little bigger. The Torah tells us, "Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham," make me a sanctuary so I can dwell upon you. And again, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how come God does not ask this earlier? So Ira says, perhaps it's more for us than it is for him. We need a sanctuary for God. Good, Ira, what do you mean by that? We'll keep going. So let's keep going. So again, what is the purpose of it? So maybe it's for us, but if it's for us, what purpose is it for us? I mean, why does God give this to us? And so Ramban offers an idea here. Oopsies, this is getting all messed up. Here we go. The Ramban says as follows. Read in the English. This is an introduction to our parsha here in Parshat Teruma. So it says as follows: when God spoke with Israel face to face, conveying the 10 commandments, and he commanded them via Moshe some of the laws which are like main headings of the laws of the Torah, as our rabbis would teach proselytes seeking to convert to Judaism. And when the Jewish people agreed to do all that they had been commanded by Moshe, God then forged a covenant with them over all of this. And from that point onwards, they would be his people and he would be their God. And as he had stipulated from the outset, and now, if you will diligently obey me and observe my covenant, then you will be special for me. Exactly like we saw in the Psukim. And he says, and you will be a Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, right? So skip down. Therefore, God commanded the matter of the Mishkan at the outset, that he would have a house in their midst that was sanctified to his name, and there he would speak with Moshe and command Bnei Israel. And the crux of the purpose of the Mishkan is the place where the divine presence rests. This is the ark, as we'll see in our Parsha, and I shall meet with you there, and I shall speak with you from the covering. And so the Mishkan, the Ramban is telling us here, is fundamental. It's an essential element of our Avodat Hashem, our service of God. And it is the center, if you will, of like Jewish consciousness. Now, if that's the case, if that's where we meet God, so what do we do now that there is no tabernacle and no temple? How do we create that relationship where we put God in the center? Well, there's really two ways that we do it. The first way that we do it is what I would call national memory. we have all types of these customs and practices and parts of davening that have to do with Zecher LaMikdash. We do things in remembrance of the temple and the tabernacle that once was. For instance, on Yom Kippur, what do? We have an entire section of the Avoda, which is the special service that was done on Yom Kippur by the Kohen Gadol. Why do we read it? Well, we're trying to remind ourselves, national memory of what once was. The second way, which I think is a little bit more complex, which has to do with prayer in general and our houses of worship and our shuls, right? Divine service, we daven. And by davening, we're trying to bridge a connection we have to bridge our connection to Hashem. Ira puts in the chat here that what he means when we say it's more than for us than it is for him, that we need to feel like there is a place where we can find him and pay tribute, though we know he is everywhere that isn't tangible. And that makes sense in terms of why we daven and why we daven in a special, specific place. Maybe like Ira was saying, that gives us that place. But what's interesting is that this entire conversation about the Mishkan, the purpose of it, some suggest, is not so much to create a space for God to, for us to interact with God or God to interact with us, or a home for God. Well, that's true. It actually has a higher purpose. And perhaps some suggest that the purpose of the Mishkan is actually to provide atonement for the sin of the golden calf. We have the sin of the golden calf, God gives the Torah, sin of the golden calf, and then all of a sudden we get the commandment to give the Mishkan. Now, there is a fundamental problem with this approach. What's the issue with this approach? Well, the issue is the order with which the Torah records the stories. So last week was Parshat Yitro. Parshat Yitro is the giving of the 10 commandments. This week, not last week, 2 weeks ago is Yitro. Then we got Mishpatim, the special laws. So again, that's all kind of one larger conversation, the giving of the Torah. Now we got Parshat Teruma and Parshat Tetzaveh, which talk about building the Mishkan. So we have a commandment. And then we get to Parshat Kitisa, which comes after Parshat Teruma and Tetzaveh, which describes the sin of the golden calf. And so those who want to suggest that this forms a sense of atonement for the sin of a golden calf have to wrap their heads around, well, the golden calf incident takes place in terms of the chronology of the Torah's parshas after the commandment to build the Mishkan. And so this creates a very famous debate between Rashi and Ramban, called Ein Muchar Umukdam B'Torah, that when the Torah tells us something in its text, do we take the Torah sequencing as literal, as actual chronology, or does the Torah write based on themes, and that just because something happens later doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place elsewhere, and that it's could be potentially put in another place, which means, for instance, that just because in Parshat Kitisa we read about the golden calf, well, the golden calf probably links back to the giving of the 10 commandments, and that this comes afterwards. And that's actually how people read this, that the tabernacle is actually a atonement for the sin of the golden calf. And there's a lot we can say about this. And I think even a few years ago, we talked specifically about how there's direct correlations between the golden calf and the actual tabernacle itself. You've got like the Karnei HaMizbeach, you've got the horns of the altar, and other tie-ins to the golden calf. But I want to actually focus on a very different approach. I think a different element of the Mishkan, which I want to call the creation of the Mishkan. It's a play on words. Because if we look actually very carefully, the stories, and if we were together, we would all have a Chumash and we'd flip through the Chumash together. The story of the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan should sound very, very, very familiar to us. Take a look at the little chart that I was able to put together over here. Let's start with the Mishkan. They shall make me a sanctuary. They shall make me an ark. Make a table. Can't read the words, right? Moshe saw all the skilled work, and behold, that he had done it as God commanded. They had done it, right? Moshe blesses them. Moshe completes the work. All the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting was completed. So that might not remind us of anything, but when we put it side by side, it actually sounds very, very similar to the story of the actual creation of the world, right? God made, they shall make for me. God made the sky, make me a sanctuary. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Moshe also saw all the skilled work that had been done. They both see the heaven and earth and all the array were completed. This is the end of the story of creation. Everything was completed. Same language here. All the work of the tabernacle was completed. God completes the work. Moshe completes the work. God blesses the seventh day. Moshe blesses them as well. And it was sanctified. And also we find that we're meant to sanctify the Mishkan as well. And so when we compare these narratives, we'll actually notice a few interesting things. For example, the word asa, to make, is used in both narratives. We see it used 7 times in the creation of the world. It's used many more times in the story of the creating of the Mishkan. But there are these like key words: make, see, complete, bless, sanctify. The word work, that ties these narratives together. And by the way, in case you think it's just the text itself, which is hinting to us one way or the other, the Chazal and the Midrash also talk to us about this. Look at the Medrash Tanchuma here. Why does the verse say, God, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells, in Tehillim? And the answer is because the Mishkan is compared to the creation of the world. How is this so? And the Medrash actually, I only gave you a piece of it. It goes on and on. On the first day of creation, we're told, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it is written, he spreads the heavens like a curtain, kiyiriyah. Concerning the Mishkan, what does the text say? You shall make curtains and goatskins, yiriot, izim, same word, yiriyah. On the second day, we find, let there be a firmament. And the concept of division appears. As it's written, let it divide waters from water. By the Mishkan, we see, and the parochet. What's the purpose of the parochet? The parochet also divides sections. And so what we're seeing here is a tremendous amount of similarities in the story of the Mishkan and the story in the creation of the world. And the question is why? For what purpose does the construction of the Mishkan recall or remind us of the creation of the world? Right? Why are we being asked, in a sense, to do it again, to repeat creation? What's the significance of that? What do you think?
I think you could make the argument that we got it wrong the first time. We did all of this stuff and ended up with a golden calf. So maybe we need to start all over again.
Interesting. So this is like a redo on the world.
A mulligan.
When else do we find a mulligan or a redo on the creation of the world?
Noah.
Right. So right. God, it's not the first time that God suggests a redo. In fact, the story, we were just talking about this in our women's class earlier today. The story of Noah actually and the ark very similarly also reminds us of the Mishkan. For example, we said that when Noah is commanded to build the ark, he needs to coat it with tar on the inside and the outside. The ark of the covenant, the central piece of the Mishkan, is covered in gold on the inside and the outside. We talked also about how the word kofar is the Hebrew word for tar, which is also used as well. Kofar is the same root of the word atonement. And we talked about how perhaps the Mishkan either provides atonement through sacrificial work, or alternatively, it could be atoning for the sin of the golden calf itself. So one possibility, I think Paul is correct, is that God is saying we need to recreate the world. That's one possibility. I want to maybe share another way of looking at it. But before we do that, let's make one other interesting note. How many verses or how many psukim does it take for God to create the whole world? How many chapters? Let me make it easier. How many chapters is creation? One chapter, right? One chapter, first chapter, Breshit, Parshat Breshit, chapter 1, right? One chapter that tells us the story of creation. How many chapters or how many psukim are used here to describe the building of the Mishkan? Hundreds of psukim, hundreds, right? You got like 15 chapters. I told you, Teruma, Tetzaveh, Vayakel, Pekude, and then even a little bit in Vayikra as well. How could it be, if this is simply a restart of creation, like Paul is suggesting, why is there such an extraordinary disparity between these two creation stories? If this, in a sense, is creation, well, why not let us just have one chapter which says, and make for me a tabernacle, and use the similar words and be done with it? Why do we have to go on and on? And by the way, it's a repetition, because Vayakel Pekude is a total repetition of this as well. We're going to hear the same thing in 3 weeks' time. So what's the significance of this?
Hashem didn't want us to make mistakes like he originally in one chapter. He's more deliberate. He goes over it and over it. Every fine detail, he goes over it not only once, but many times. He wants to get it right. He doesn't want anything to fall through the cracks.
So he's trying to make us be more deliberate. Okay, I think that I want to maybe take that idea and turn it just a tad, which is when we think about the world, right? This is it's God's world. Like the Torah, for instance, is not our book; it's God's book, right? It's God's book of mankind. It's not difficult for a all-powerful God to make a home for humanity. It's not hard. But what is difficult is for human beings, given our mistakes, our vulnerabilities, our finite wisdom, it's much more difficult for us to make a home for God in this world, right? And perhaps this is emphasizing for us like how hard it is to bring God's presence into our lives. It's easy for God to create a world for us. He's God, all powerful. And perhaps the disparity is meant to highlight this difference between God's creating the world for us and the way that we create the world for God, or a space for God, a home for God. But building off of that, again, let's go back to this big question about why the Mishkan recalls the story of creation at all. Why is that even significant? And so we have to then ask ourselves, well, why were we created? What was the purpose of our creation? What were we meant to do? Well, the Torah actually tells us, like, what is the purpose of life? Look in Bereshit. Vayomer Elohim, God speaks to somebody, probably the angels. Naaseh Adam b'tzelmenu kidmutenu. Let us make man in our image. He should be like us. Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzelmo. God was created in God. Man was created in God's image. B'tzelem Elohim bara'uto zachar nekeva. Bara'utam. God created them, male and female. Vayivarech otam Elohim. God goes and blesses them. Vayomer lehem Elohim. He says to them, Peru urvu, be fruitful and multiply. Umilu et haaretz, fill the land. V'chivshuha, and conquer it. Uradu v'gigat hayam v'of hashamayim v'chol chaya remeset al haaretz. Fill the earth, master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds, the sky, the living things that creep on the earth. Right. So the Torah here is telling us why is man created? We were created to rule over the world, right? And we fulfill our potential by being what? Like God. We were created in God's image. God said, make God like us. God says, make man like us. So the way that we fulfill our potential is to be like God. And what does it mean to be like God? The Gemara in Sota asks this question explicitly. Rabbi Chanina, my dichtiv, achrei Hashem Elokechem telechu, that we should go after and be like God. How can that be possible? Is it even possible to go and walk and follow in the words, the step of God? It's not possible to do it. God is described in the Pasuk in Devarim as a devouring fire. You can't approach fire. You can't be like God. So what does it mean that when the Torah tells us that our mission is to be B'Tselem Elokim, that we're supposed to conquer and realize our potential in a way similar to God? So the Gemara explains. What does it mean? Allah, lahalach achar midotav shel kadosh baruch hu mahu. What does it mean to follow in God's ways, to be like God? So mahu malbish harumim. Just the same way that God is malbish harumim, just in the same way that God that clothes the naked, like he clothed Adam, so too, we also should clothe the naked. Just as the Holy One Blessed visits the sick, as we see that he goes to visit Abraham, the Lord appeared to him before the Belo name Mamre, so too you should visit the sick. As the Holy and Blessed, he consoles mourners. As we see, it came to pass after the death of Avram that God blesses Isaac his son. So too, you should console mourners. Just as the Holy One, Blessed be he, buries the dead, as it's written, and he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab, so too, you should bury the dead as well. So what does it mean, according to the Gemara Sota? That from the very start, man is called upon to act in this way that imitates God, and we're supposed to live just lives, right? And the same idea, I think, underlies the very construction of the Mishkan. Just as God creates the world and causes man to dwell in it, so too man is called upon to build a place for God, right? And through this action, we, in a sense, become partners in God in creation. We are meant to be like God. We're meant to be kind and just and have good ethics and values. And we're meant to literally work with God to create, to be partners in his creation. That's the entire idea. We're meant to be conquerors of the world. So the whole idea of bringing us back to the creation story is to say that we as mankind, we are literally partners with God. But there's actually another element which is very significant to what else that we're meant to do as human beings. What else does God tell us is our mission in life besides being like God? Well, the Torah tells us that Vayikach Hashem Elokim et ha'adam vayinicheu v'gan Eden la'avda u'shomra. God puts us in the Garden of Eden to do what? We're put in the Garden of Eden. It's a totally different picture of what man's purpose is. We're there to tend it and to guard it. And this description of creation and man's role within it is different. And yet we also find a parallel to this role, a different role, if you will, for mankind. For example, when we try to compare the Garden of Eden to the Mishkan, we'll find a whole bunch of similar languages. The same language here, le'avda u'lishamra, right? That we need to work it and safeguard it. Look how it's in Bamidbar, how it's described. V'shamru et kol klei oel moed, ve'mishmer b'nei Yisrael la'avod et avodat hamishkan. Take charge of all the furnishings. Keywords here, la'avod, right? That's one keyword here. And shamor, same thing, le'avda u'lishamra. Same language. There's a lot of comparisons between the Garden of Eden and the Mishkan, right? God appears as being mitalech bagan. He walks through the garden, and the Mishkan. We also use the same language of hitalachti, that God will walk in the midst. We also know that what was on top of the ark, there were kruvim, these angelic forms. What was put to safeguard the Garden of Eden? Vayigarish et ha'adam, following the sin, original sin. Vayishkon mikedem legan eden et hakruvim. After God throws out man, he stations the kruvim. What are the kruvim? They're there to protect the Garden of Eden. We see all these tie-ins, or just another one I thought of off the top of my head. One of the articles of clothing that the Kohen Gadol wears is the Kohen wears a ketonet, right? Some type of like a robe. And what does God make for man after he sins by eating from the tree? Right? Kotnot or. He makes for them some type of clothes. So we see here that there really is a second aspect to the building of the Mishkan that ties to these two different elements of creation. The first aspect is viewing the essence of Mishkan as the actual doing, the action of creation, paralleling God's act of creating in the world. But the second aspect focuses really on the result. What's the result of the creation of the world? Well, God goes and is in the Garden of Eden with man. They're like together. God is walking through the Garden of Eden. And what happens when we build the Mishkan? God's divine presence, also like the Garden of Eden, walks among us. It's a return to the idyllic world of the Garden of Eden. And so maybe then, it's not that the tabernacle is atonement for the sin of the golden calf, but maybe what is it an atonement for? For creation itself, for the story of Adam and Eve. They were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. They could not be close to God in that way. God had created the world and then created a space for God and man to interact. Once again, in our Parsha, man is being charged with creating, just like creation in the world, and creating a space for man and God to interact again. And it's the same parallels. And so by building the Mishkan, it's a tikkun, if you will. It's an atonement for the sin of the Garden of Eden. And when the Jewish people leave Egypt, they are Am Yisrael. They're one nation. And this building of the Mishkan is facilitating a return to the state to which God goes amongst the Jewish people. We know that Adam could not live in this spiritual tension. He sins and is thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And the question that the Jewish people are being faced with in this week's Parsha is whether or not they can now meet God's demands. Can they avoid sinning? Can we avoid it from happening? Now we know the sad end of the story, which is the temple is destroyed, that we can't do it, right? We know that the Jewish people we know that the Jewish people are eventually going to slip and to fall, and that the Mishkan and the temple both are going to be no more. That we won't have that place. We won't be able to go back to that idyllic stage of the Garden of Eden. But yet at the same time, what is it that we can do? Well, let's go back to how we started. What's the purpose of the Mishkan? It's really twofold, really. It's number one, that, like, I mean, what do we do if we don't have the Mishkan? There's two things: national memory and prayer. And so when we create those spaces, when we create holy, beautiful shuls, or we create holy, beautiful services and religious experiences that take us back and that tie us to Zecher LaMikdash, reminding us of the temple and the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the purpose of doing so is to also take us back to an idyllic state where God walks in the garden with us, where we're able to interact and feel his spirituality and be ultimate partners in creation with him. And that is something that we can continue to do even with the temple not with us. We can continue to be partners with God, and we can continue to create and to try to create those holy spaces to give ourselves a small taste of that holy and special relationship. Okay, questions, comments, or concerns?